Yeah, so Kevin Power has a PhD in philosophy from University College Cork. Kevin is interested in the concept of interdependence as understood in Zen Buddhism, with a particular interest in how our beliefs shape our behaviors. Over the last 2 years, he has taught ethics in UCC, University College Cork, with an emphasis on environmental concerns, and he currently lives with his wife and daughter in Castle Gregory, County Kerry.
So I'm talking tonight on the topic of ecological compassion and specifically on John Moriarty and interconnection with nature. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to present some of the important biographical points of Moriarty's life and then present 4 recurrent themes in his work that partially explain human disconnection from nature. And then I'll read 4 extracts from his autobiographical writings which explain the need for and his experience of immersion in wild nature and some of the tension and inner conflict he felt as regards his own impact on the environment. Moriarty was born in 1938 in Moyvan, Kerry. This is important in context for just to be aware that he was very aware of nature from early on, so he's rooted in a rural farming household. He's also raised within the Catholic tradition, which we'll see is fairly important also. In 1962, then he graduates with a degree in philosophy from UCD. And in that he enters into a life of learning and teaching about Western and European ideas, which we saw in the video to begin with was a very formative experience for him. So in 1965, he moves to Manitoba in Canada and he lectures in the university there on history of European ideas. So he enters again a life of not just learning about, but teaching and spreading the ideas of Western and European philosophy and history. In 1965, he returns to Ireland. And again, as he alluded to in the video, what he wanted to do in this case was to rediscover what he called his bush soul. So he lives often in solitude in areas like Inishbofin and Connemara, and then he moves and settles in Killarney. So his work is generally as a gardener. He gives occasional lectures and interviews, and he published 9 books before his death in 2007. And throughout Moriarty's work, then, we get themes that suggest some of the roots of disconnection from nature. And what I'm going to do when I read through the extracts is kind of highlight in his work and in his story how they come through. But to give perhaps an idea of 4 of the main ones, we have things like religious, cultural, and philosophical context. So, for example, the book of Genesis, Moriarty is brought up within the Catholic tradition, and it's the story that he's familiar with until, as a young man, he comes across Darwin's Origin of Species, which shakes him out of his Catholic story. But given his his Catholic upbringing, the book of Genesis obviously emphasizes that the earth is there for people to use and do what they will with. So nature and the fruits of nature are for us, and that in its own way creates a separation between ourselves and nature. He was also fascinated by, but not entirely non-critical of, Greek mythology. And in the context of what we're talking about tonight, he uses the example of Theseus and the Minotaur. So the Minotaur is this wild beast, and Theseus slays it, and in doing so makes the world a little safer for civilization. But civilization is a thing that also does great damage to nature, and Moriarty will emphasize how important wild nature and wildness actually is. We'll see that in an example in a moment. Then we have Cartesianism, which is something that Moriarty is, again, kind of fixated on in his writings and constantly coming back to. So René Descartes' philosophical project was to understand the connection between mind and matter, but that assumes that there are aspects of reality that are fundamentally different and separated from each other rather than interconnected. So Descartes' work was a major influence on the development of modern Western philosophy, and therefore did a lot to encourage the idea of dualism and separation. Then movement essential versus movement local is phraseology that Moriarty uses throughout his writing. And the best way to highlight that is to come to an example. So one of the extracts will give us an example of this. And then we have his concern about the over-reliance on commercial and technological advancement. So economic and technological development there are intimately connected, and a lot of destruction of nature in the form of roads, industry, urban centers, dams, canals, and so forth results from this. And again, a good way to highlight this is just to listen to the man himself talk about it. So the video we saw earlier on was from a little earlier in his life. This next extract is from a video you can find on YouTube with Tommy Tiernan. It's from a little bit later in his life, 2002, I believe. So if the audio is fuzzy for anyone, you can read along as I've transcribed it. And in this, he talks about his the importance of nature and wildness also.
We shape the earth to suit us. We plough it and we knock it and we shape it and we reshape it. Dolphins were land animals once, and they went down into the sea. They said to the ocean, as it were, shape me to suit you. And now the Lord save us. I was in a house in Connemara there sometime recently, and I saw a dolphin bone. The curve of it was as beautiful as any couple of bars of Mozart's music. It was so beautiful. Like, I've no bone in my body that is shaped to the earth like that. Like, so they said, shape us to suit you. We went the opposite way. We shaped the earth to suit us. That's going to fail. I'm just saying that shaping and reshaping, if we turn the whole earth into a Holland, we're gone. Because, like, unless there's wildness around you, something terrible happens to the wildness inside of you. And if the wildness inside of you dies, like, I think you're finished.
So again, maybe just to expand on that, I'll start with this first extract from his writing. These are all autobiographical writings, so they're coming directly from him, from two books called Nostos and What the Curlew Said. So I'm going to start with an extract in which Moriarty, having just quit a very promising academic career, has returned to Ireland, and he's living in the solitude that we saw him kind of surrounded by in the video earlier on. And he has a series of transformative experiences in nature. But now, the lake still mirroring the immaculate world and mirroring me in it, I had collided with what I had become, and I felt the anguish of having to start all over again. I imagined it. I would be the mosaic maker of my own mind, and pristine sensations of the pristine world would be the tesserae. Taking my time with it, I would look at a red patch of sphagnum. Picking it from one of the wizened bushes behind me, I would taste a haw. Growing on the next rock I'd pass, I would touch a little tussock of sable moss. Without picking it, I would smell a stem of bell heather, and then, sitting by a turf fire at home, I'd listen to a curlew calling below on the shore. Starting again with sensations such as these, I'd remake my own mind. On the way back across the bog, I came to a stream that runs down into Loch Fada. Finding a place where the bank was level with the water, I knelt down and immersed my head 3 times, baptizing myself out of culture, baptizing myself out of Christianity. Thinking that I might follow to Owen Glynn all the way up into the mountains, I came to a waterfall, as much a cascade as a waterfall, and I stopped short. In the riverbed just down from the plunge pool, there was an outcrop of rock, the water rushing either side of it. I figured out how, by jumping from one to another stepping stone, I might get to it dry-shod. Finding a surface of it that was both dry and not so jagged, I sat down, well knowing that I'd be here for at least a few hours. Closing my eyes, I found myself wanting to get to know this cascade, this fall, purely through hearing. Distinguishing them from the overall roar and getting to know them individually, I attended in turn to each little rush and run. Even within the big collapse and fall of it, I found variety. As if this was nature's Eroica symphony, I got to know all the instruments and what they were doing. The waterfall in all its voices, near and far, loud and not so loud, I got to know. In the end, all awareness of the difference between subject and object in abeyance, it was to hearing itself I was listening. And what an unnaturally strange experience it was, hearing. Time was when there was no hearing in the world, but then some redundant jawbones were redesigned and put to new use, and it happened. Hearing. I listened to the strangeness. In the end, there was no me. The strangeness was listening to itself, quite without my being aware of it. There had been a transition from I am listening to listening is, from I am hearing to hearing is. Of its own accord, no active work required. It continued a long while. Then a sense of selfhood returned, and reoccupying the center, I opened my eyes now, starting all over again. I set out to get to know what was in front of me through the sense of sight. Numerous to hearing, it was equally numerous to sight. But how utterly different from each other were experiences of hearing and seeing. That long, lovely pouring there in the cascade, I will remember what it sounded like to hearing, but now experienced in seeing, what an altogether different reality it was. Returning to hearing and then coming back to my seeing many times over, I gave myself all the time I needed to live the difference. The sense that there is one world, I thought, is pure illusion. There are in fact as many worlds as there are ways of perceiving. I settled into the experience of seeing. Again, but only after a long time, the sense of selfhood slipped away, and once more there was a transition from I am seeing to seeing is. Time was when there was no seeing in the world. Then some cells became particularly light sensitive. Images appeared, and there was something marvelously new in the world. There was seeing. And how strange it was, how very strange it was. So in this experience, Moriarty was breaking out of his religious conditioning from his upbringing, as well as the intellectual conditioning of his academic life that he had lived for so long. And these were forms of conditioning that he believed were part of the problem of humans damaging the earth. And this experience represented an overcoming of the dualistic or Cartesian mode of seeing, as Moriarty went from understanding himself as part of a world intellectually to actually experiencing himself as one with it. And he did this independently and on his own. And I'd like to note as well, it seems like something that, had won the spare time, which he did. We could all try this, but it has many parallels with documented meditative experiences in traditions like Zen Buddhism. So the next extract is a little shorter, and it's just a little autobiographical note. And in it, Moriarty expresses concerns over his role as a gardener. So he's working as a gardener on an estate, and he projects this concern into a more universal point about the conflict between people and the world of which they are a part. That day, I happened to be hoeing the gravel in front of the house in Letterdyfe. It was groundsel mostly, and dandelion that kept coming through. On any reckoning, this wasn't creative gardening. It was a chore I had to undertake 3 or 4 times over the summer. Here again, I was a despoiler, getting to the plants before they had a chance to reseed both lawn and yard with their kind. I look at such a globe of seeds and I think how little of the genius that is in nature has emerged into the human mind. Looking at it, I think the extent to which we have emerged from nature is the extent to which we are merely clever. Unlike the dandelion, we have now no rhizome, no rhiza, no root down into the nourishing earth. And so the reference in that extract to humans as merely clever is an example that we could use to illustrate his differentiation between what we call movement local and movement essential. And I'm not sure if Mary McGillicuddy is on the call tonight. She wrote an excellent book called Not the Whole Story about John Moriarty. And I'd like to thank her for reminding me of this after the last talk I gave this, because it's such a central notion. So we can think of movement local as progression merely through physical means. So we can think of things like the automobile, the airplane, or engineering devices that allow us to kind of plow and shape our earth. Whereas movement essential is progression through evolution of perspective, or of something more essential, a change in our essence. So in that example, on the small scale, the dandelion is doing exactly what it needs to do. It's growing in place, and Moriarty is questioning why, other than for merely cosmetic means or cosmetic wants of the owner of the land, presumably, does he actually need to move the dandelion? Then when we think about movement local, this more to what his view would be a more limited type of movement. I'll give you a large scale one, which would be the moon landing. And Moriarty references the moon landing as an example of this a couple of times in his writings. So As much as it's an impressive technical feat to land on the moon and go that far, it still imports the same kind of problematic mindset that people have sometimes with their disconnection from nature. And one example we can use of this is the fact that there is a nation's flag planted on the moon. So the idea of nationalism, the idea of one bit of land being more important than another, has now been imported to the moon by human beings. So that suggests that whilst we were able to do the local movement, as he would have it, in a really impressive way, there wasn't necessarily an attendant perspectival shift that suggests that there's a kind of a paradigm shift or an essential change to our species that took place because we happened to land on the moon. So for the final extract here, I'm going to talk about a period when Moriarty moved back to Kerry, and he builds a house, and he very explicitly worries about the impact that it will have on the environment. And he admits to his own inescapable hypocrisy about ecological concerns. Satisfied that a house here wouldn't damage the landscape, and assuming that I would get planning permission on it, I bought it. Permission secured, I went up one day to plant some bulbs around the place. All day long I heard loud drilling noises, and when I made inquiries, I was told that a quarry, long since idle, had been reopened across the way. It was going to be a big operation. Having come to Kerry a few weeks later to give a talk there, I looked at a site that I felt would suit me. Again, there was the business of planning permission. As soon as it was granted, I phoned Matt O'Sullivan, an auctioneer in Clifton, and I asked him to sell both my house and the site in Gorriman. The house had cost $4,500, that including the $1,500 I had eventually given to Mahal McCahill for the site. It made $40,000. The site in Gorriman had cost $4,000. It made $16,000. I paid for the site in Kerry, and expenses deducted, I had $42,000 to build a house on it with. People who had been annoyed with me because of my environmentalist campaigns I had been involved in, now they had me where they wanted me. Always with the barb and the humour, they would accuse me of being a land speculator. Among a group of us at a funeral one day, Tom Pete himself mischievously joked, he came to Connemara with nothing, and soon he'll be going away with thousands. Another day in my house, he looked at my books and said, quite a few trees knocked to keep you entertained. My response was to come out every time with my hands up. Privately, I was uneasy, and it didn't mollify my conscience to think that all of this had happened as a sequence of reactions, not by preconceived design. And to make matters worse, still hoping that something might happen between me and Eileen, I was building a 3-bedroom house in Kerry. This meaning that, if it didn't work out, then here I was wrapping £23,000 worth of the world's scarce resources around my own 4 bones. If someone called me a fraud, there was little I could do but agree. So here you see a person who's really struggling with their own sense of responsibility with regard to their local as well as their global environment. And again, he's kind of projecting his own personal experience onto the universal experience when he talks about the use of the world's resources. So even though he's had previously in his life this transformative experience in nature, which helped him overcome the dualistic aspects of his cultural conditioning, he's still a person living in a world where one needs to use resources and, in his own words, as we heard earlier, shape the earth to suit himself. So in the interconnectedness of all things, it's often not possible to do good without doing some attendant harm. I was thinking that we could actually ground this in the experience that we're all having together now, right? Because we're all gathered here, presumably because we're concerned about humans damaging the planet. And yet, in order for us to connect the way we are, we have to use devices that are made from, precious finite minerals that are extracted from the ground. And we have to use electricity, which is taking up a huge amount of energy. So I thought this would be a good way to segue to this conception of compassion that might be relevant to our concerns tonight. And I think Lucy might be saying a bit more about this, and I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts in the Q&A if we had time. There's a philosopher called Jay Garfield who does comparative work between Western and Eastern philosophy. And he wrote a book called Engaging Buddhism and Why It Matters to Philosophy. And in it, he talks about this concept of karunya, which is a Sanskrit word, and it refers to a divine state in Theravada Buddhism. It's usually translated to English as the word compassion. And that's in large part what we're talking about here tonight. But Garfield kind of retranslates this word because he thinks the way it's being translated into English is a little bit limited. So quoting from his book, karunya connotes not just an emotive response to another, but a commitment to act on behalf of others to relieve their suffering. To cultivate care in this sense is to recognize both the omnipresence of suffering and or interconnectedness. It is to recognize that one cannot solve even the problems of one's own suffering without caring about that of others as well. So I'd suggest that those principles can and probably should be extended to our local and global environment. So because of our interconnectedness with our environment, both the human and the non-human part, we can't always have a positive impact. So this is something that you can take away tonight, or we can discuss afterwards. But it's just to think about how mindful we should be when dealing with others and when interacting with our local ecology, because we may, through our own circumstances, have maybe blind spots or failings. And I'd like to thank Lucy as well for reminding me of this in correspondence in the lead up to this talk. We were talking about the fact that in the video we watched earlier on, Moriarty was planting rhododendrons that are now considered invasive. So even in his gardening, again, he was doing something that might have been a bit destructive, even though he was involving himself with nature. And this idea that we should have humility in the face of nature at all turns. Yeah, hopefully we'll get to share some ideas on this in the Q&A or afterwards, but I just wanted to sign off by saying that it's in practical everyday actions, even though this stuff is quite philosophical, it is also quite grounded. As Garfield says, it's about action. So moving from an idea of compassion as something where you're just worried or caring about something to where you're actually acting on something. And I guess in environmental terms, that can be, on a volunteer level, it can be reflecting on your own consumption and use of resources. So with our everyday actions, we can remind ourselves to see the non-human and the human as fundamentally interconnected, and the harm of safety of one is intimately and intrinsically connected to the harm and safety of the other. So I'll hand it back over to you there, James. And thanks everyone for listening.
Thanks, Kevin. That's great. So just a reminder to everybody, so Lucy Weir will be our next speaker, and then after that we're going to have 30 minutes for a Q&A and a discussion. So please put your questions in the chat box, and then you can say, if you wish, who do you want to put them to, or if you want to just share some comments or thoughts that you have, that's also welcome. Thanks, Lucy. So we just have a few questions so far, so if anybody has some other thoughts, please put them in the chat box. So I'll start with these ones, these questions, kind of comments. I'll put these two together. And Kevin or Lucy, you can see if any thoughts come to mind. If we're human and alive, we are in some way part of the problem. However, if we are genuinely going lightly and working to be part of the solution, then our contribution to the problem is acceptable. And the other comment was, I used to want an electric car, but now I realize that is not a solution. A lot of our solutions are just as harmful, but just in a different way. Lucy, do you want to comment on that for starters?
I would love to, and then I'll be as brief as possible. I did promise to be brief. I didn't realize I'd gone on so much. But in my thesis, I said, we can blame SUV drivers. We can blame electric car drivers. We can blame anybody else. I think that none of us, is perfect. None of us lives a perfect life. We all cause harm. It's just the nature of being alive. I mean, the most compassionate thing probably not allowed to say this, that we could do is to shorten or even end our lives. But, you know, that wouldn't necessarily be compassionate either, because that would cause harm, grief to our relations. So we're stuck with existence. What's the kind of thing we can do? We can obviously reduce to the greatest degree possible our use of resources. But if we need to buy an electric car, buy an electric car. If we can't afford to buy an electric car, you know, and you need a car, buy a car. And then look for ways of sharing it. Then look for ways of creating connection. Then look for ways of having a discussion, or even have a discussion first. And you might find that if you ask the question to a lot of other people, they might come up with other solutions. You know, people want to help one another, particularly now. So let's create community, and let's create skillful communication.
Thanks. John, Kevin, maybe you could have a think about this one. John Moriarty said that we need to urgently, he said that breaking down the Berlin Wall was actually a small act. And he said, but we desperately need to break down the Berlin Wall between us and other species. Have you any thoughts on how we can do that? And can we ask ourselves what other species, what other animals want from humans?
I think I can tie that into what Lucy just said in her response to the previous question eventually. I'll try to be brief. That's a big question. The first thing that comes to mind from Moriarty's, or from his perspective, I guess, is when in the extract about his immersion in wild nature. When I was reading that, I was thinking about how, especially during the pandemic, when people have been doing more walks and maybe being outdoors a little bit more, I suppose the role of attention. So I might say, I went for a walk with my friends at the weekend in the mountains, and it was really nice. And what that is a kind of a surface level, I did a thing and I enjoyed it. But I wonder how many people like go for walks in nature and they're in their own heads, or they're in their own thoughts, or if they're having a conversation with someone, or they're listening to something on their headphones, there's been a big attention suck away from the benefits that nature would bring them if they paid very close attention to it, and maybe even just stop walking, maybe just be somewhere in nature rather than kind of walk through nature. And I think what he did when he was having his experiences in nature was, at the very least, he was getting an extremely rich felt experience of nature that removed his ego as much as it's possible to remove an ego without, you know, just dissolving into the ether. So if you can do that for a natural phenomenon like a river, like I said at the end of my presentation, I think there's no reason why you can't extend those principles to other species. And that another, again, that's why that idea of compassion, rather than being a kind of a sentiment or an emotion, can be action. And it's not, as Lucy said, it's not difficult, but it's a challenge to do it consistently because of the momentum of the lives we've been born into, that are kind of like, you know, moving us along almost with momentum that's difficult to escape from on a daily basis. And if I could just briefly tie that off, one of the things I was thinking of again when Lucy was talking about awareness and action, and someone in the chat mentioned about the electric car thing, and I had thought of that again, the humility thing, because we don't necessarily know whether our solutions are going to end up in retrospect looking like another part of the problem. So I was just looking into the technology behind lithium-ion batteries recently for electric cars, and I was kind of thinking, on the scale that there are going to be cars in the world, if there's going to be an extra 2 or 3 billion of us by 2050, it's kind of alarming what that will do to resources that considering what it takes to build a battery for an electric car, which then got me thinking of, so often we're looking for technological solutions to things. And one of the things that stops you doing is to focus again on your attention on your own perspective, your own reaction to things. I think again that happened during the pandemic, where as much as we're all relieved that there may be a successful vaccine, part of me worries that that's just a human reaction to say this terrible thing that was most likely human caused. Well, you know, we have technological solutions for that, so we'll be okay in the end. You know, some people will perish in the meantime, but we'll be okay. And what that does is it doesn't do anything to our collective questioning of what level of consumption led to our environment being encroached on so much in the first place that a virus escaped out into the human population. And then because we have planes, we're able to transmit it globally. Well, what were we getting on the planes for? You know, can we question rather than, you know, can we question what our motives and what our conditioning does to us that causes us to act in the way we do, you know, on a daily basis and also across on the arc of a lifetime, rather than just kind of looking for technical or technological solutions all the time.
Thanks, Kevin. And I think also, like John Moriarty, he was strongly, well, he said that he believed that a lot of our technologies amplified human insanity. He actually said that. On the other hand, often in our society, every technological invention is seen as progress, and often to question a new technological invention is seen as almost being akin to being against gravity or something like that, even though it is just a human creation that is going to have some harmful effects and some benefits. This question came in from Sean Corcoran for Lucy. Can Lucy explain what is the backward step that she mentioned?
Sure, I'll certainly try. Can I just add one thing to the previous conversation about how we understand or think about things from the perspective of other species? And that today you can look in The Guardian, I think it was in The Guardian, a guy, I'm actually editing another book at the moment called Urgent Matters, which is about philosophy as a practice in response to the ecological emergency. Kevin, I'll tell you a bit more about it later. I'm one of the people who's contributing is called Paco Calvo, and he is a plant neuroscientist. Or I'm not sure if that's his exact title. I'm not sure if you can be a plant neuroscientist, but he's looking at at plant intelligence. And I think one thing that we can do is really support and look for. It's amazing what you can do when it's like learning a new word. You suddenly see it everywhere. You look for research into other species that focuses on what other species want, if you like, if you can put want in inverted commas, because we, you know, again, want is how humans understand things. So yeah, Paco Calvo's research is really interesting into plant intelligence. I think we need to pay a lot more attention to what other species need and want, and you know, there are a lot of philosophers, Mary Midgley, who have done research into that, and obviously Jane Goodall is famous for her research into chimpanzees and primates. So the other thing is the backward step, which, okay, the backward step. It's again, it's something which is really not that complicated. Right now, as you're sitting right now, if you begin to consider your own, just being here, just being where you are right now, then you are already taking the backward step. You've probably heard of mindfulness practices, and in a way, I can't stand the word mindfulness because, you know, it's been overused, and B, it suggests that your mind needs to be full. And I think that what you need to do is be able to see the mind, see what's going on in your mind from, well, yeah, maybe it is becoming a witness. It's looking at what's going on while it's going on, and it gives you a kind of meta view. It gives you it's like seeing things from a kind of seagull point of view. You can look at everything that's going on. You can look at why you're reacting in the way that you're reacting, and you can see it as almost as though you're looking at yourself from the outside. We don't need to help anybody else take the backward step. We can only do it for ourselves, and then do what I'm doing, you know, make a pig's ear of trying to explain it. But, you know, it's just another kind of failure, isn't it? You laugh at your own failures. You sort of, you keep, you do it through practice. So each time you breathe and you notice that you're breathing, in a way you're taking a backward step. Each time you catch yourself before you're triggered by somebody saying, you know, oh, you're looking fat today, you know, you stop yourself before you instantly react, and you give yourself that micro space, which allows you to let yourself attune to compassion and let the loving act happen through you.
Okay, thanks, Lucy. So there was a question.
Take a breath, I will.
So I'll put these two together. John P. Milton, this is a recommendation, a teacher of something called The Way of Nature, teaches you to connect to nature and to listen with your whole body. His primary book, Sky Above, Earth Below, he combines Buddhist thought, Native American perspectives, and his own experience of connecting with nature over the past 70 years. And then another person recommended Roman Snarich's book, A Good Ancestor. We're all familiar with indigenous peoples, Native American people spoke about 7 generations and being a good ancestor. And John Moriarty was very strongly influenced also by the myths of indigenous people. Now, we know historically indigenous people have triggered extinctions in certain parts of the world, but also today, at this, even though indigenous people make up a small percentage of the world's population, the lands that they have rights to protect the vast majority of the remaining biodiversity on the planet. Kevin, do you have any thoughts on John Moriarty's influence by Native American myths and stories?
Yes, not in depth that I can think of at the moment, but one of the things that I think comes across quite strongly, and again, I think I don't know if Mary McGillicuddy is in attendance tonight, but she would have a better depth of knowledge than this on me. But one thing that I think comes across is, so Moriarty started out Catholic, renounced it, as we said, and he baptized himself out of Christianity himself, and then returned to it eventually, not in a born again way. He said when he entered the Christian tradition again later in life, he said it was like it was for the first time. And his involvement, or his talk about Native American, or we call it maybe indigenous thought in America, and he was there and he met indigenous people, and he had communication and relationships with them. One of the things is that in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and this is coming back to the means end thing that Lucy mentioned, what you do on Earth is kind of a means to where you end up, which is somewhere kind of metaphysically, a heaven that is not here, that is not of this earth. Whereas indigenous traditions, not saying that they have conceptions of afterlife also, but they're a little more tied to land. They're a little more tied to, and their myths and their stories are a little more tied to the immediate. In the same way, I guess, that the Celtic tradition, which I'm trying to learn more about now, is there is the other world, which seems kind of mysterious and far away, but it's intimately connected to the land that is of here and now, and that we can learn a lot from that. And actually, talking about the species, understanding other species, he tells a story from the if someone in the chat knows this and can correct me, I think was it the Blackfoot? I think it was the Dakota tribe, tell a story about how they basically, the very brief version is that they massacred buffaloes every year for their food. And then one year the buffalo kind of learned not to do this. And in this animistic way, one buffalo kind of entertains or he comes along with the idea that he'll marry the tribal leader's daughter in return for them giving up their meat every year. And this happens, and then eventually, the father wants his daughter back. So he goes and he tries to rescue her, and then the kind of leader buffalo gets angry and murders the father, and the daughter starts crying, and the buffalo says, "Oh, you weep. We didn't know that people weep." And it's a reversal of the human-animal dynamic, where we treat animals as produce a lot of the time, but then animals have feelings. What a surprise! And then the end of the story is basically this. It's quite magical and animistic, where the buffalo agree that they'll kind of dance. They'll live in equanimity with the people again, because they've suddenly realized that just as the buffalo themselves weep or feel suffering when their tribe are killed, they now understand that people feel suffering when their kind are killed. So in lessons like that, it's not very scientific or whatever, but the role of myth can engender a feeling of compassion between species as well by that understanding of suffering.
Thanks, Kevin. And one of the key points that John makes as well is that when we're isolated from other species, we also lose the medicine and learnings that other species carry. We're unable to access it, and we have this, he often talks about this loneliness of isolation, being isolated from other species. This question is, I agree, compassion and interconnected thinking is how we should evolve. Perhaps, Lucy, you can have a thought on this, but how to have these conversations beyond our silos, in particular building a critical mass toward agency to care for nature. Are you muted?
Just once. Okay, yeah. Now I'm unmuted. Okay, it's a great question. I would say that there are two things that we can do. The first is skillful communication. So if we're talking to people who disagree with us, who don't recognize, for instance, that there's an ecological emergency, then I think it's really important that rather than say, this is the whole point of the them and us thing, rather than say, you're wrong, the way to do it is to find common ground, find something or understand what their position is, so that you can find a place to start a conversation. And in yoga terms, this is skill in action. It's not easy, but there are various tools that you can use. Nonviolent communication is a really good tool, and there's masses of stuff on the internet about that. I think it's important not to continuously inflame the situation by, while protesting is great and important, it needs to be very carefully done. If it's done in a way that creates violence, then all you're doing is increasing attitude polarization. So if you can't think of a way of communicating successfully, then pause, wait, and just learn about self-compassion. I always teach that there are three kinds of compassion. It's an artificial division, but compassion towards yourself is compassion towards other people, which is compassion towards the more than human world. When you're in a good relationship with yourself, you tend to not be so wasteful with goods, and you tend to be a better able to have good relations. So communication. And the second thing is community. And community is building numbers. So it's what we're doing right now. This is a way of building community. So, you know, I don't know many of you, and I hope that you will get details about me, and that we will be able to communicate and create community. You create community by saying, you know, what interest do we have in common? And then you think, right, what could we do if we went for a walk? Would we be able to, in Cork, you know, maybe get together so that we can plant some trees somewhere? Does somebody know a councillor? You know, can we get together on plastic waste? Can we get together on, you know, so groups of people can get together? I mean, we are the people who are going to have to deal with this. So we need to create communities. Rather than pointing at others and saying they're doing it wrong, let's learn to do it right. So communication and creating community. And then hopefully the critical mass will happen. But then the end isn't important. Creating community is in itself important. Good communication is in itself important.
Thank you. So somebody else put in this comment, which is a nice way to end for the evening. Thich Nhat Hanh says, when we fall in love again with the earth, we will know what to do. And we need a collective awakening, that individuals do not awaken in isolation, but we need to awaken together in communities. And you can see, obviously, Thich Nhat Hanh, lots of his writings are available, and his talks online. So I would like to thank again our two speakers, Kevin Power and Lucy Weir. Thank you very much for making your time available to join us this evening. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us this evening and participated in the event. Fridays for Earth will be happening on the second Friday of every month throughout the year. So we look forward to seeing you again at an event in the future. So take care and stay safe during this time.